Hi, this is Jaya. In this video, we shall see the summary of A Woman of No Importance, a play by Oscar Wilde. This play was written by Oscar Wilde in 1893. Here he satirizes the Moses, restrictions and repression of upper class British society. We all know that Oscar Wilde was a much celebrated Irish playwright who died in 1900. His very famous works include The Importance of Being Earnest, The Picture of Dorian Gray, The Ballad of Reading Goyle, De Profundis. Among these, The Ballad of Reading Goyle and De Profundis was written when he was in the jail. This play opens with Act 1, which takes place on a terrace at Lady Hunstanton's estate. She is throwing a party. Among the guests, Lady Caroline Pontefract decides to attract the much wealthy American Hester Worsley. As both of them talk, Lady Caroline Pontefract expresses her dislike for Gerald Arbuthnot, but Hester finds him very attractive and she admires him. As these two are talking, Gerald enters to announce that Lady Illingworth has agreed to take him as a secretary. Now, this shows that he has gone upwards towards gaining financial success and political influence. And Lord Illingworth also has ambitions of becoming a foreign ambassador. Hearing this, Lady Hunstanton immediately sends a letter to Gerald's mother inviting her to dinner. Gerald asks Hester to take a walk with him, leaving Lady Hunstanton and Lady Caroline to gossip. They discuss about Mr. Kelvil, who is a politician and has been writing about the subject of purity. Mr. Kelvil says it is a good thing that the influence of women in society is on the rise since they are inherently moral and pure. Lady Hunstanton says that Lord Illingworth doesn't seem to see women that way. She feels that Lord Illingworth is a womanizer. At that time, Lord Illingworth enters and he refuses to accept any thanks for hiring Gerald. He says that he has appointed him as a secretary out of his own self-interest because he was fond of the boy and wanted to help him. At that time, a letter comes from Mrs. Arbuthnot, who says that she will not be able to dine with them, but she will arrive after that. Lord Illingworth and Mrs. Allenby speak alone, discussing Hester's purity. Lord Illingworth says he can make even the most puritanical women fall in love with him, and Mrs. Allenby challenges him to prove it. At that time, Lord Illingworth happens to see the letter from Mrs. Arbuthnot and says that the handwriting looks familiar. Immediately, Mrs. Allenby asks him whether the handwriting reminds him of anyone, and he replies, a woman of no importance. In the next act, the women are having an argument over English versus American society. Hester says that English society punishes women who have sinned, but it does not punish the men. She feels that both parties are equally guilty and deserves to be punished. At that time, Mrs. Arbuthnot arrives in the drawing room and Lord Illingworth also enters the drawing room shortly afterwards. Gerald introduces the two and Lord Illingworth reacts strangely. Mrs. Arbuthnot looks at Lord Illingworth and says whether he is now about to change his mind about his offer to Gerald. The other guests depart for the music room, but only Illingworth and Mrs. Arbuthnot stay behind. While they discuss alone, we find out that Gerald is the illegitimate son of Mrs. Arbuthnot and Lord Illingworth, who was formerly George Harfoot. When they were young, they were in love and Mrs. Arbuthnot became pregnant. But George refused to marry her and therefore she was forced to face the scandal of life as an unwed mother. Now Mrs. Arbuthnot asks Illingworth to leave her son alone, for he is now all hers and that is who she is the only person whom she has. But Lord Illingworth refuses, saying that Gerald should be able to choose his own future. At this time, Gerald comes back and Illingworth says to both of them that Gerald has all the qualities he could want in a secretary. And he asks Mrs. Arbuthnot if she has any other reason to object. Since she does not want to tell Gerald about his true parentage, she says she has no other reason. In Act 3, Lord Illingworth and Gerald speak together about Mrs. Arbuthnot. Gerald says that he is very protective of his mother, but he only wishes that she would tell him about his father. Lord Illingworth agrees that Gerald's mother is a great woman, but he also says that men do not desire great women. At that time, Mrs. Arbuthnot comes there and she says that it is unforgivable to ruin a woman's life. She and Hester disagree over whether parents' sin are visited on their children. Later, Mrs. Arbuthnot tries to tell Gerald about his true parentage, but she does not tell him directly, but she tells the story as a third person. Gerald doesn't understand her and expresses his frustration that she is not happy about his new position. Hester interrupts, entering the room in distress. She says that Lord Illingworth tried to kiss her. Gerald gets angry and tries to hit Lord Illingworth, but his mother stops him by telling him the truth that Lord Illingworth is his father. A subdued Gerald takes Mrs. Arbuthnot home. In Act 4, Gerald is writing a letter to Lord Illingworth inviting him to come to their house to propose to his mother, Mrs. Arbuthnot. Lady Hunstanton and Mrs. Allenby come there to pay a visit to Gerald's mother, but he tells them she has a headache. He also explains that he will not be taking a position as his father's secretary. They leave and Mrs. Arbuthnot comes downstairs and Gerald tells her about his plan. Hearing his plan, she gets horrified and says that Lord Illingworth is not welcome. Gerald argues that it is her duty to marry his father, but she refuses to marry a man she hates, telling him how hard it was to raise him alone. Hester comes there, overhearing their conversation, and tells Mrs. Arbuthnot that she has to change her mind and that God's law is love. She says she will use her wealth to take care of both of them. Gerald and Hester leave to enjoy the garden together. Lord Illingworth comes there and insists on entering the house. He tells Mrs. Arbuthnot that he wants to offer Gerald's financial security and some property. Mrs. Arbuthnot tells him his help isn't needed. Illingworth reads Gerald's unsent letter and offers to give up his position as foreign ambassador to marry her. But she refuses, telling him her hatred for him and her love for Gerald sharpen each other. Angered, Illingworth admits that Mrs. Arbuthnot has only been a plaything for him, and is about to call Gerald his bastard, but Mrs. Arbuthnot slaps him with his own glove before he can. Lord Illingworth leaves and Mrs. Arbuthnot falls onto the sofa in tears. Gerald and Hester enter and Hester assures Mrs. Arbuthnot that she will take care of her as her own mother. Gerald sees the fallen glove on the floor and asks who has visited them, and Mrs. Arbuthnot now answers, a man of no importance. And here we find the play ends with Wilde skillfully satirizing the hypocrisy of upper class society and the cruelty of punishing only women and not men for having sex outside of marriage. A Woman of No Importance has been adapted for film and radio multiple times. It's a beautiful play by Byoscar Wilde, and if you have anything more to add on to what I've said, please write it in the comment box, like the video, share it with your friends, and if you have not subscribed my channel, please subscribe. Thank you.